All right, welcome to the new JFK show number 217. We have a special guest and longtime colleague of Jim Fetzer and Larry Rivera. So we have Ole Dammagard from Spain, Dr. Jim Fetzer from Wisconsin. We've got Larry Rivera, formerly from Puerto Rico, but now Florida. And I'm over here in Mississippi in Bay St. Louis. So we're going to let Ole bring up something that's very dear to him and some new information, which we're all beginning to find out that maybe our lives were a lie all along. So welcome to the show, Ole, and go ahead and take it from here.
Thank you so much. We had planned to do a JFK show tonight, but since there's so much going on, I did not have time to prepare a PowerPoint. So instead, we were talking about what is going on in my life at the moment. And what I'm finding out is very, very bizarre, to say the least, because it turns out that if I'm correct, that my whole childhood and my whole life up until I was 30 has been a lie, an absolute, that my father was living a double life, that we had no idea about this at all whatsoever. But it turns out now more and more, the more I dig into it, that he seems to have been very high up in secret ops, connected with NATO in the Cold War and so on. And so if you want to, I can just take you sort of on my trip of
discovery.
Yeah, of discovery, because it and also it could maybe be interesting for you to follow this whole thing when I find out more and more and more stuff, because I feel strongly that this is way, way bigger than just my family, but it has to do with the whole creation of the Stay Behind Gladio network in Europe, and also the strategy of tension with the CIA, the whole Cold War, and these forces that are still very, very dominant in this control and the destruction of the world as we know it today.
And which are also important background to understand against which the assassination of JFK took place.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And so it was, I've always wondered how come that I have been so designed to do these things. How come that I have this, I don't know what has given me the gift of being able to connect the dots in ways that a lot of people don't seem to see. It's like in my life, I've been prepared for these type of things without really understanding it. And now, a few months ago, my dad, his name was Eric, he died in 1992. And I grew up, let me take you back. When I was born in Denmark, some 15 years more or less after the Second World War. And my dad was very much involved in the Danish resistance movement against the Nazi occupation of Denmark. Because in 1940, when Hitler's army started moving, they hit both Norway and Denmark on I think it was the 4th of, it was April of 1940, the 9th of April. They hit both Denmark and Norway and put them under occupation. And what happened in Denmark was that it seems like the whole thing was set up because Denmark just gave up. I don't really know what, but the Danish government just laid right back on their back and gave up, which really upset the army, the police, and a lot of Danish citizens, because all of them were ready to fight, and then boom, they were ordered to stand down. So in these times, there was a creation of a Danish guerrilla movement, like a resistance movement. And in that resistance movement was one of the people involved, and it was my father, who was a military. He was a lieutenant at that time, and he became quite high up. He was the number 2 in charge of certain areas in Copenhagen. there was the head of this resistance movement who was called Skipper, and then my dad and one of his friends called Peter Ban was the two chiefs of the Unit 1. And also at the same time as they were doing all kinds of things against the Germans, trying to sabotage and do whatever they could to make life horrible for the Germans in Denmark. My granddad was helping Jews to escape to Sweden, and he was put in jail for 3 months, I think. My grandmother was involved, or my grandmother's sister was involved in delivering weapons to the resistance movement in baby cots and so on. So when I grew up, I heard a lot of these stories about how important it is to stand up for what is true and right, even though you're in the minority of one. Because, I mean, Denmark is a joke. It's such a small little country. So when somebody with a massive military force just comes and takes over, what do? Do you just lay down and die? Or do you fight? Or how do you deal with it? And one of the ways that the Danes dealt with it was through humor. They were very much, keeping the spirit high and then finding ways of just trying to do everything they could to resist what was going on. But anyway, when I grew up, in Denmark, there are no guns whatsoever. It's not like in the US, or there are no guns. But when I grew up, there were guns in many different areas where we went to on vacation, when we went to see friends. And so, for instance, like I found, when I was just a little kid, my brother and I found 3 pistols in my father's office. It was a Colt 45 automatic, the US model from 1911. There was an FN Browning from Belgium, and one more that I cannot remember. And sometimes when we went to see his friends, I remember machine guns and stuff, and I thought that was normal. But now when I grew up, I'm like, holy crap, that is absolutely not the normal thing in Denmark at all. And also in the summers, we went to visit some friends, and up until the age of 20, I was very, very much interested in guns, and especially the historical Wild West. So my dream was to become a gunsmith. So I was very much involved with that. So for me when we went to see friends in the summer, there was especially one place where there were 2 families living in the same farm, and in the barn, they had made like a shooting range up on, they had taken hay bales, hay bales, and they built sort of like a building inside the barn, and it was a shooting range. So we were shooting all kinds of weapons in there, and they had like Bren guns, like machine guns, heavy artillery. And they were like grenades, and these things. I just thought that was super cool as a kid. I didn't even think of it. But then over the years, when I was about 8 years old, my dad. I'm giving you the romantic version that we were told. We had gone to Sweden, and on holiday. And we had rented a house from a guy there, and he had in the 50s he had bought about 20 farms, because it said that the price was so low that he bought all of these farms. And when we came up there, my mother fell in love with the big forests. I mean, they're massive, beautiful areas in the south of Sweden, and so my father and mother decided, let's see if we can buy one of these farms. So that they drove around and they picked one, and they bought it super cheap. I mean, it was like that's like $2,000 for 3 hectares with 2, I think it's like 3 acres with 2 buildings and a big barn. I mean, that it was a super deal they made. Anyway, so a year later, so we had this like a summer farm in Sweden, and then we had a 300-kilometer drive back to Copenhagen, where we lived in a villa, which was very, very close to the airport. Anyway, so he was, my dad's background was that he was in the military in the Second World War. Then there's about 10 years after the Second World War that I'm now finding out that I have no idea what he was doing during these years. I have absolutely no idea. And then in 1955, he meets my mother. My brother gets born. I get born a few years later. And then he suddenly, from earlier on, he was living in a bus behind a gas station. Sounds a bit like a loser to me when he met my mother. And then suddenly he got this top position with Esso, which is owned by Standard Oil, Rockefeller. And suddenly he was sort of the, what would you call that? District, the chief,
Manager.
Yeah, but he was the manager for all the gas stations in the greater part of Copenhagen. So he comes from a loser type of situation, and suddenly, boom, he's in a top position in Esso. And what his job was to take care of all of these people that had gas stations. They were like franchises. And what I remember is that so many of these people that he was taking care of were former people from the resistance movement. And so in around 65, 66, there were several of his colleagues that suddenly died before the age of 50 from stress. That is what I was told. And my dad also had an accident where his car, he was poisoned by carbon monoxide in the car. And then after that, he was taken to a mental institution, a mental hospital, where we went to visit him. And then some months later, suddenly we moved to Sweden. I mean, with no warning, with nothing. It was like my brother wasn't even allowed to go and say bye-bye to his friends. And we emigrated, boom, to Sweden. We just, one of his friends from the resistance movement drove us up to the farm out in the middle of absolute nowhere, very, very fast. And we moved there to this house it was not prepared for winter. It was from the 1730 or something like that. There was no running water. There was no toilet. There was nothing. And the winters are really rough in these areas. So for us to just move there without any preparation is quite drastic. But what we were told was that my dad had a fallout with the chiefs at the Esso company, and that for some reason he just asked them to go to hell. They tried to bribe him or buy him back. They offered him a director's villa and a very high pension, but he still refused. And then he came also to Sweden, where we started from absolute scratch in the middle of absolute nowhere. I mean, there was like half a mile to the nearest neighbor. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And my dad was sort of like a guy who was, he liked the big city, you know, he liked to be in the center of things. He was a very militant person in many, very, very dominant. So it was very strange how we ended up there. And then, but I was always told, or we were told, the kids were told that, no, but it was like my mother was so in love with the forest, and my dad said, of course, if you love it so much, let's just change country and the whole thing, the whole shebang, let's just do it. And when you look at it, I always had a feeling with so many different things in our lives, there's something wrong. And I think maybe it prepared me for getting into these areas where Jim and I and Larry, we've been in so many many years digging into these things where there's something wrong. We're not being told the whole truth. And then my dad had a career going straight down. I mean, really, when you look at it, quite tragic. I mean, he did not like Sweden at all. We were the only people that were there were farmers. He couldn't speak the language. He never bothered to learn it. He became quite lonely. And in the end, his last job was in a metal factory, sitting, you know, from 7 to 5 in a horrible, very loud factory where I worked there for a year as well. My God, I wanted out every single hour. And then he died in 1992. And the last thing he had on him when he died was a ring. And that ring is a US Air Force ring with a red, it's a, what do you call it, a purple amethyst in it. And so that is very strange for a Danish citizen, I would suggest, to have an American Air Force ring. And when I look at photos, he's had it his whole life. He said that it was just a gift from one of his friends, but he did not have any American friends officially that I ever knew of. So then, so I always felt that there's something here that is not right. And I've said the last few years that I have a feeling that my dad could possibly have been part of building up Stay Behind in Denmark, while the Stay Behind movement was a good thing. Because Gladio, or Stay Behind, there are many different names for this, was or is, I would say, was an operation that when NATO was created after the Second World War, Denmark was one of the founding nations. And also in the end of the Second World War, the Allies took over the control of the resistance movement in Denmark. Okay, so there is if somebody wanted to build up this very secret ghost army called Gladio, I mean, the whole idea was that should any NATO country be invaded, I mean, in those days, the threat was from the east, then what they did was that they created hundreds and hundreds of cells with 6 to 8 people in them, where they were given weapons, fuel, food, radio equipment, ammunition, everything needed, that was then buried or hidden. And the idea was that there would be like hundreds or even thousands of cells in each NATO countries, hidden, that no one knew about. Not even the people in the network was aware of the whole picture. But the idea was that should an invasion come, then the leaders of the country, the royalties, whatever, would bugger off to London. And then with just more or less one phone call, they could activate a whole army on location, fully armed, fed, with all needed equipment, could be, boom, activated like this, which I think it's absolutely brilliant when you think of it. It is a fantastic resistance tool. And I believe that the more I look into it, I believe that this was what my father was part of building up in Denmark. Because a few months ago, I had a dream where my father came to me and he said to me, the key is in the ring. The key is in the ring. And I woke up with those words, the key is in the ring. The key is in the ring. So I'm just going to show you his ring. Let me just show you my dad. This was, can you see this?
Yeah, great.
Okay,
Yeah,
this was during the Second World War, when he was a lieutenant, before they had to surrender. I mean, he went black, he went underground, he had a false identity, and let me just show you another one. Here's my dad with his dog. He came from the cavalry what used to be the cavalry. And then somehow he was changed into the Air Force, the Danish Air Force. And there are like, I'll show you the ring as well. I'm sorry, I haven't prepared this properly. So
your dad looks pretty military to me there.
Well, he sure was, I tell you that. I'll show you here. This is my dad. And can you see here on his finger?
Yes.
That is the ring. It was really interesting. I had a friend here who he himself had been living sort of a double life for many years. And when he saw this photo of my dad, he said, well, there's one guy with a lot of secrets. I was like, what? He said, this guy has lived a life with a lot of secrets. I never saw that in the eyes of my dad. But
how could he tell, Ole?
Sorry?
How could he tell? What were the signs?
No, he just said, since he used to live this double life, he said he could recognize it in the eyes of my dad. I don't know, but he said it takes one to know one. And so I just thought it was quite interesting. But do you know, sometimes there's like, I would say, divine synchronicity when things are just being pulled in, and the people you meet in life is just like, this is unreal. What are the chances of me meeting this person or that person at this time? I don't know about you guys, but in my life it happens quite regularly, and it's just fantastic. And so I was in Denmark a while ago, and there's a documentary maker there. Her name is Ida Grøn, and she has made a documentary that has won some prizes here, and it's called My Grandfather's Secret War, Stay Behind. And in that movie, she and her father, they're interviewing her grandfather, who's now 93. He was more or less the exact same age as my father. And so they're talking about to him about his secret life, and they're talking to some of his friends that are on the deathbed, and they're starting to reveal what has been going on. And it turns out that this grandfather was funded or paid by the CIA up to the mid-'80s, doing all kinds of very strange operations with NATO and so on.
Gary, do you need to flip the...
No, we're still looking good.
Oh, okay. Okay, go ahead, Ole. Sorry.
No, so there's three people. There's my father. There's one of my friend's father. I don't know what to call her. Let's call her B. And the documentary maker's grandfather. All three of them are the same age. My father and these two guys. And when you look at them, during the Second World War, they have been very, very close to each other. I mean, the same little city, the same military installations, the same this and the same that. And I truly believe that they knew each other. And both these people, my father, my friends, I'm sorry, let's call her B's father, and the one who made the documentary, these two men left in 1952 to the US. One of them he was a dentist officially, and he went from Denmark to the USA to get an education as a dentist, as you do. But instead he ended up as an elevator operator. That's the official story, in the very same building as Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles. So he was with them, officially going up and down the elevator. That is absolute BS in my world. Yeah. He was in that building with them as part of this operation. When he came back home, he was moving around a lot in Denmark. Nobody really knew where he was. They only saw him at the weekends. Otherwise, he was officially a dentist moving around, and nobody knows what he was up to during these years. Then my friend B's father, who also were in the exact same locations as my dad and the other ones in the documentary film, he was a driving instructor for military vehicles, they said. So he went to the US to get educated like this. But I'll show you a photo of him when he was educated to do this. Hang on, and let me just find another one, because this one just blew my mind. Let me just see if I can find it.
Hate to tell you there, Ole, your dad was not the elevator operator.
No, it wasn't my dad. It was not my dad.
None other than Alan Dulles, of all people.
This is my friend's father. And do you see who is he standing next to? That's Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower. This and my friend here, I hope it's not too confusing here, but my friend's father, this is a photo that he cherished till the day he died. He died very close to when my dad died. And here he is with Dwight Eisenhower. This is not a group photo. These two people are watching something. I would say some kind of military exercise or operation or something. I would suggest is going on here.
And your dad's friend right here, your dad's friend.
I don't know if they knew each other, but I bet they did. I mean, they were in the same city, the same military installations and so on. And we found when I started, because my friend she had no idea about this. She just said, oh, look at this cute photo. I almost fell off my chair. I said, that's Eisenhower, my God. And it turns out, so we started going through her papers and to see if there were some letters maybe he sent home. And there were letters from Fort Benning, Georgia. And Fort Benning, that special ops, is also where Dwight Eisenhower met Lemnitzer. Now we're close to the JFK operation. You know, these type of people went in and out of the Fort Benning. And it's special ops. It's also where the schools of America is, you know, with where they trained assassins and torturers, and you name it. So here suddenly we have a very strong connection with the U.S. And my dad. These are the years when I had no idea where my dad was, but I strongly believe that he might very well have been with these guys in the U.S. as well. So this guy came back home. I mean, he was being trained as they said, a driving instructor for military vehicles. Does he look like a driving instructor to you? I don't think so. But anyway, that is the official story. And so he was traveling around in Denmark and nobody knew what he was doing. And my dad, the only thing I know from these years was that he was in the Danish Air Force, where he was, his task was to drive around and put up towers for airplane identification. So if there were hostile planes coming in over Denmark, they would say, oh, it's a Russian, oh, it's a... But Denmark is a joke. It's such a small little country. There's hardly any hills. And would that take him 10 years to drive around and say, there's a hill over there, let's put a tower there. There's another hill of 15 miles down the road, let's put a tower there. You could do that sort of like in a few weeks. So what was he doing the rest of the time? But his job as this driving around, finding these places, were also this networking, just like, anyway. So the one who made the documentary, it was her granddad, and that was the elevator operator, okay? And when he came back to Denmark, he had with him, because of apparently this job as an elevator operator, that must have been very exclusive, because I mean, I don't know, but when he came home, his granddad. This is. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay. This is what he brought home. This is from. He still had the car. It's a Chevy 55 Cabriolet, and this was in the mid 50s. So, for somebody who is an elevator operator, to get a car like that, brand new and
convertible.
Convertible, and it imported from the US to Denmark. I mean, really, is that what we're supposed to believe? And I spoke to Cody Snodgrass, the CIA whistleblower. He said it's very, very normal for intelligence agencies to reward people with cars and hookers or whatever is good, you know, or money or whatever. But cars is one of them. So this was the guy in the documentary. That was what he was given. And my dad, as you remember, he was living behind a gas station. That's the official story, in a bus. But 1957, this is what he had. Check out this one.
57 Chevrolet. You know how much that's worth today?
I know. Do you know how much it was worth in those days? I mean, this is brand new.
Yeah.
So how the hell was he able to afford a car like this? And it's not a normal Bel Air either. It's a different type. It looks like a Bel Air, but it's a very rare model also. And inside it, there was these silk seats and embroidery. But look here. Can you see behind here in the background?
Yeah, military.
Military. This is it's a 57, so this must be, and my mother is in it. She's sitting here. So it must be the earliest 57, 58. That's like 10 years after he finished the military. Because the part that he was working for with putting up these towers, I've checked it out, and those operations ended 53. So what is he doing here with these military guys in the background? And these people are not just like guards or something. They are fully equipped. So am I boring you?
Oh, on the contrary.
Because I think
fascinating stuff.
It is, I mean...
Well, it reminds me of Peter Janney's story and St. John Hunt's. Have you ever talked to St. John Hunt about all this?
Yeah, not about this. I know St. John very well, and I know about his story. So, but I'm part of sort of grasping what's going on here, because, for instance, here is this villa we lived in. Because my dad lived in a bus. And then suddenly he was one of the bosses for Standard Oil or Esso in Copenhagen. I mean, that was a top position, okay? And they lived in a villa. How could he afford a villa? Where did that come from? So this is where we grew up. It was in this, his office was here. That's where we found the pistols in the wardrobe. But when I look at that, I mean, he was working a lot, and one of the things that he was doing was taking people to nightclubs, you know, representation or thing. But if you're dealing with gas stations, who would you? What kind? I remember there were foreign guests as well that he took, and his job was to make them happy, you know, and whatever. But if you're in charge of gas stations, I mean, what kind of international guests would you take care of? I think that what we're looking at is that this network of gas stations in Copenhagen was part of the Danish Gladio network, because I believe that this whole NATO operation was partly funded by Rockefeller through Standard Oil, and where in a crisis situation, fuel is one of the things you want to control as well.
Sure.
So by controlling the gas stations, you can just lock the whole thing down. if you want to, if you need it. And also, when I compare to the documentary, my granddad's Secret War, I'm in contact now with this woman who made this movie. I've invited her here because I think if we start talking, this is gonna be really interesting. But everywhere when she was moving as a child, turned out that the neighbors were part of this network as well, and that in the different villas they had gun depots. And we were always told, or I was terrified of going down into the basement because someone told us that there was a witch underneath the stairs. And I believe what was under the stairs, I would not be surprised if that was a door and they had stashed weapons down there. And also when you look at where this is, sorry, I'll show you this one first. Okay, so this is where the villa is, okay? And this is where the biggest airport in Denmark is. Can you see that villa is you cannot get closer to the airport. So if we're talking airport, possibly tunnels, military activities, whatever. Also very close to here, there were different underground fortresses because in those years, in the Cold War, if you know where Denmark is located, you got Scandinavia, you got Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark underneath. But Sweden was neutral, and Finland was occupied by the Russians. So actually, the front line for NATO towards Russia was the east coast of Denmark, which is exactly where we lived. And this is also, if you look here, that is where the bridge now goes to Sweden because it's the closest to Sweden ever. So it's a very, very specific point where we lived just there, like 1 kilometer from the closest point towards Sweden, the airport, military installations, and so on. And the more I look at this, I do not think that villa came out of nowhere. I think that was part of the network and that he was given that as part of his job for ESO. One of the furnitures there as well, in my brother's room, was a desk, okay? And the desk came from, I kid you not, it's, I'll show you where it came from. It came from, we're getting there. I don't have the map here now, but it came from the US Army Thule Air Force Base on Greenland, which was top secret during the Second World War. It's up there. I mean, you cannot even get further up to the North Pole. And the reason why it was so important was that, and I have a cat here apparently.
Love it, love it, love it.
Because
I just lost mine of 18 years, and he was to get on the air all the time too.
I'm sorry to hear that.
18 years.
But this Thule Air Force Base, I mean, there's nothing there. It's Greenland, it's ice, and there's this installation. It's so tiny, but super, super important, especially during the Cold War, because they had sort of a radar system that could identify if there were incoming missiles or air, from the east, whatever. That was the point where they could check it out. So I ask you, how the hell did we get a desk where it was sprayed on the side, American US Air Force Base, Thule, Greenland? And one of the things during those years when my dad was, I don't know where he was, I remember him telling us that he was on this, he was on a ship, a tanker, that was, let me just see here, it was called MS Esso Aarhus, which was a super tanker, it was a big tanker. And we just know that he was on it. I remember he said, "Oh, the waves were so high." Never heard anything about where was he going? When did he come back? When was this? And I believe possibly, I'm going to guide you into more of these NATO areas. And I believe possibly that it was my dad that went on this, when he went on this tanker, that they were going to this NATO installation on Greenland. Because otherwise, if you have a desk, I mean, it was not a fancy desk at all. I mean, it would have cost a fortune to get it down from Greenland to Denmark, but not if you were on a big tanker where there's loads of space, and I mean, you can just chuck it on board. Why? I don't know, but how did that desk get into our house? And so,
this is really extraordinary stuff, Ole.
It is, and when in 1970,
together, I think you're doing a great job of piecing it together.
Thank you. When let me just see here, because in 1970, I also checked that the resistance movement did not have the type of weapons that my dad had. They were totally different guns, and I was. It also feels like I was almost being tested. When I compared my life to my friend and the one who made the documentary, it was almost like they were trying to keep these networks in the families, you know, where they could trust people. And I feel that possibly I was being tested because since I was so much into guns when I was younger, I remember we went down to Denmark, and every time we went there, and also the people that came to visit my father, all of them were from the Danish resistance movement. And so one time we were down there, and one of his friends, the guy that was second in charge, together with him in the resistance movement in Copenhagen, he said, "Would you like a machine gun?" And I said, "Yeah, I would love it." I mean, I was, you know, but who would get, you know, even offer a thing like that? And I remember my dad was preparing, you know, we stashed the machine gun under the seat, the passenger seat in my dad's car. And then in the morning when we were going to drive home, my dad said, no, I have a very bad feeling. I don't want to do it. And fine. So we didn't do it. But what kind of logic? Who would do a thing like that? I mean, I don't get it. And it was, I'll show you what kind of machine gun it was. It's this machine gun here. One of these. Yeah. But I'm trying to figure out.
Leave it up. Leave it up a second, will you?
Why the hell would they do a thing? Why would he offer a thing like? And I think when I compare my life to the other two people's life, then maybe they were just somehow trying to test me and see, can I be trusted? Would I freak out? Would I be nervous? You know, how? I don't know. I'm just guessing here, but I just find it very bizarre to offer somebody a machine gun. When I was like, what can I must have been somewhere between 14 and 17. But it doesn't make sense at all to me to do a thing like that. And in 1970, there was a jubilee where the guy that was in charge of the Danish resistance movement, his name was Skipper. This is him here. He was the one that was sort of in charge of the whole thing. And they decided to have one last big gathering of all of them. So they went to his villa, and I found in the what do you call it? Like they made like a nice pamphlet from this event. They tell the story. Okay, we wanted to make a party, so we gathered in, and they say that they gathered in his villa. Okay, let me see here. I can't find it here, but anyway, they said they went to see Skipper in his villa, and his villa was in a very specific place where we used to go during the summers, and that is it's a very beautiful place. It's almost like the White Cliffs of Dover, where there's in one place there's this church that is sort of hanging out over the cliffs because the sea has eaten.
Go back to that, Ole. Yeah.
Can you? They sort of build up the church so it won't fall. But
can you go back to the earlier?
Yeah.
Wow, that's like paradise.
That is the sheer cliff right in front of it. Yes.
It is. It just goes straight down. I'll show you some other photos. Okay, it's like chalk. Mm-hmm. It's very. This is why it's so everything grows
to the White Cliffs of Dover. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. It's the exact same phenomena. Here, beautiful places. Yeah, and there's where the church is, and this is where I told you before. This farm where we went, where they had this shooting range built into the farm, which it's unheard of in Denmark. I tell you, officially, these places do not exist. And inside the house, there were all kinds of weapons everywhere. You opened a wardrobe, there was a Bren gun there was like a machine gun there. I mean, for me, it was paradise. But when I think back, I'm like, what kind of house was that? Anyway, and that was just like a few miles down the road, very close to this place where we sometimes went for a holiday and to take a swim. But anyway, so Skipper, the guy in charge of the resistance movement, his villa was right here out on the edge of these cliffs, and they call it the Adventure Villa. I have that from this pamphlet. Okay, so what happened, or what I've just found out, is that they very recently have opened a Cold War museum with a bunker, a NATO bunker, right underneath where we used to go. And I think the entrance for that was through the villa where Skipper used to be. And I mean, we're not talking just any type of installation. We're talking high-tech, super-duper, in those days, the top of the line NATO defense. This is frontline NATO base towards Russia. Missiles,
and
the whole
contemporary technology, yes.
Yeah, and it's like 18 meters underneath.
Wow.
And so it's exactly where we used to go, is where these things were. And when did they build it? They started building it 52, exactly when the two other friends, if they were friends, which I believe, went to the US. I believe my dad was there as well with them, being trained in intelligence work, whatever that was, because this was the Cold War. It was that people were terrified of the Russians. And like my friend B's father, he was in Fort Benning, Georgia, where Montgomery was. I think that is where the photo was taken. But like I mentioned before, Lemnitzer was there as well, because I've seen in Eisenhower's memoirs, and so that he met with Lemnitzer in Fort Benning as well. And in the place in Denmark, that little town where all three of them were at the same time, and the military installation there with tunnel systems under a school with a massive bunker they just found out now. One of the first people that came there after the war ended was Montgomery from the Allied forces as well, to that military installation where my dad was, where her dad was, where the documentary maker's grandfather was. So I think these three guys, and my friend B's father said that he was one of 5 that was in charge of whatever. And I think my dad was one of them, her dad was one of them, and the grandfather of that other guy was one. Because my dad always had this he had this authority around him. You know, there was something about him, like he was used to being
obeyed.
Obeyed. If he said something, that was it. I mean, and this is why I call my childhood boot camp, because it was like we could do whatever we wanted as long as we did it. He said it was like management by fear, but no violence. And so.
Ollie, this is utterly fascinating. Utterly fascinating. I know Larry's going to have questions too. Larry, would you like to ask Ollie about some of his experiences?
Well, you know, this is fascinating, and it seems to have some kind of relationship. I don't know. I'm looking into the Frank Olson case. You know, who you know the Olson case, don't you, Ollie?
Yeah.
Because he happened to have been his father happened to have been in Sweden also, and he was.
But
yeah,
and this is exactly it. Frank Olsen is a Danish name, and
right.
And there's all of these things going to Norway as well with MK Ultra. There was one Norwegian doctor.
Right. So that's where all this is, you know, kicking around in my mind here. You know, with the way that you've been describing it, and the people involved. You've already mentioned Dulles. I think Sidney Gottlieb also needs to be mentioned. You know, in this type. And so I think we're on the same page here.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a mental institute. I mean, we went to Norway several times when I was a kid. I don't know why we went there. I can't remember we were doing anything, but we went to these things. And the woman who made the documentary about her granddad, they went to Norway as well. And there was things about the U-2 plane, spy plane in Norway. And in these airfields, they were looking at this super secret airplane in a plane hangar or whatever you call them, and I mean it's at a point, I tell you, where when I speak to Cody Snodgrass, the CIA whistleblower, when he started asking me about my mom as well. And my mother was multi-language. She spoke like 5 languages. She was a translator. She could do what do you call it, fast hand
Shorthand.
Yeah, she was very beautiful. She looked quite a lot like Raquel Welch.
Sounds like she had it all. Very valuable person for a lot of people.
This is exactly what Cody said. A honey trap, and she had all the assets or the skills for an asset. So he said he thinks that both of them were involved. And I'm like, what? Are you kidding me?
Look how much sense it makes, Oli. If one were involved but not the other, you'd have to keep it secret. So better than both be involved.
Yeah, let me just get a photo of my mom. You can have a look yourself.
Yeah. Isn't it stunning stuff, Larry?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's, you know, that's why, you know, this MK Ultra, you know, is almost like it's just completely jumps out at you, Jim. You know, and also the multinational ESSO Corporation.
Yeah.
You know, the Dulles angle. You know, and how.
Yep, it's all interwoven.
Yeah, and how.
Oli, speak, Oli, speak, and we get you on the screen. Speak.
Okay. So here's my mother, and.
Oh, pull it back slightly. Pull back slightly. Back toward you. Yeah, there you go. Just a little.
Very beautiful.
You gotta keep talking to keep you on the screen.
Yeah. Okay. So I keep talking. Okay. So this is my mother, and and what?
She was a beauty.
Your mom was hot, no doubt about it.
I think so. And Cody said, well, she was a spook as well. And I'm like, I'm having major problems wrapping my head around this. But yet again, this was during the Cold War, when this was a good thing, you know,
I think this is part of the reason why you're so good at what you do in ferreting out false flags and covert ops. You grew up with it, only not even knowing.
this is what I feel as well. It's like I've been prepared for this without me, and then
100%.
Okay, so I'll take you now to Sweden, because what I think happened was that I'll add another thing as well. One of my best friends is a Dutch whistleblower. His name is Willem Velderhof. He was a commercial pilot for many years for KLM, and then he discovered that there's toxic air coming into the airplanes with nerve gas, which is very, very dangerous. And he spent many years, doesn't matter, but it turns out that his grandfather was the chief of Dutch intelligence in Holland, not Denmark, but in Holland. And in 1965, he suddenly, for no apparent reason, left in protest. You know, he left his well-paid job as head of the intelligence and just disappeared off the radar into oblivion. I mean, he just went very quiet. He was, I think, quite bitter, never mentioned anything about why he left or anything until the day he died. Well, in 1965, this is where my father's colleagues, he had like 2 or 3 of them that died before the age of 50. And I believe that if what I'm suspecting is correct, then the people working for ESSO in Copenhagen were part of this network. And I think that in 65, that is where Gladio, from being a really incredibly good defense tool, turned into this terror tool, or they made a switch, a change of direction with the CIA's strategy of tension, where they would commit random acts of violence against the population, especially of countries with leftist governments. And then through these violent acts, they would get the population to accept more and more surveillance. This is exactly what we're looking at.
Security, more government control, more surveillance.
Yeah, exactly. And so many of these operations that I've been looking into here in Europe, I swear to you, many of the people committing them comes from the Gladio network now. So I think that in 63, late 63, they took out JFK. 64, and here we have the cat again, 64, major changes on so many different levels. And 65 was when they moved Gladio into this terror tool that later in the 60s became when they started doing these I need to take him out. Just
Oli, it's fine. Oli.
Press pause. Okay. Take him outside for a second.
No, sorry.
We're resumed, yes.
No, so I think what happened was that when Stay Behind made this drastic change, my dad said, absolutely no way am I going to be part of this. I think his colleagues said that as well. And so I think these people did not die from stress. I believe that they might have been popped off.
You were taken out because they knew too much.
And my dad...
You weren't going along with the program.
Exactly. And so my dad was also targeted, I believe, with this carbon monoxide poisoning.
Yes.
Because it was very strange also because he said that he had test equipment in the car for carbon monoxide poisoning, but this day it didn't work. Is that normal to have things like that in the car?
No.
I don't think so. And my dad also had a bodyguard for, I don't know when, but he had a bodyguard. So,
don't you have a bodyguard, Oli?
No.
I mean, isn't that something? This is absolutely fascinating. Gary, do you have a question you want to ask Oli before we have to part tonight?
What's going through my mind is when Jesse Ventura became governor of Minnesota, he was taken down to some place at the bottom of the state capitol, and he looked around, and everyone seemed to be a spook. But it looked like normal people. It looked like your next door neighbor, your friend's daughter. He just couldn't tell them apart. And it seems like, you couldn't tell them apart either. It's in your own family.
No, exactly. Can I just add a few things?
Yeah.
So I think that when we left very quickly because my dad feared for our safety. This is my new interpretation. because why would we move so fast? And he stayed behind to deal with them. And I think that he might have come to when he didn't die and he survived, he was still a threat because these people knew too much about the network.
Yes.
And that he made some kind of deal, just like Chip Tatum or Cody, where he said that I agree to discredit myself. I mean, Chip went to jail, so did Cody, so that if they stepped forward and started talking, the dark forces could just point at them officially and say, well, this is a jailbird, you can't trust him. So I think that it's possible that my dad went to this mental institution just to discredit himself, because there's no logic
You're
to go
100% right. No, that's perfect.
Where was your dad on November 22nd, 1963? And if you were with him, what was his reaction?
I have no idea. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember him being very, very nervous about that this could start the Kennedy assassination. I cannot remember. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so
I'd say you weren't with him at the time.
I don't know. But we moved to Sweden, and we moved out in the middle of absolute nowhere. Then the closest neighbor, they had like a little electric power station driven by water. So that would be a very strategic thing as well. So my dad went to see them, and then suddenly they decided to sell. And they sold to a guy from the Danish resistance movement, who just happened to be the CEO of Scandinavia for Johnson & Johnson. I mean, what?
Yeah.
And then
powerful players on the international scene.
Yeah, the multinationals keep popping up, Jim.
Right.
All the time. Should I ring my bell?
Yeah, just to add one more. And then the third farm in this little area was also bought up by a guy from the Danish resistance movement. And Cody says that this is a standard way of making safe houses. You have buildings very close to each other, or houses, so that you can move people very quickly if something comes.
You're getting a lot of benefits from your association with Cody, Oli, I can tell.
Yeah, I do.
This is very, very, very good. Oli, this has been utterly fascinating. I look forward to our next installment when we'll talk about your research on JFK, but this has been an invaluable background for all of that, Oli, and everything you do.
Yeah, you just never know. All right, fellas. All right, this is going to be JFK show number 217 with Oli Dammagard. Appreciate everyone for being here.
Thank you so much for listening.